Everyone, my name is Heather McKenzie. I'm a speech language therapist and educator, and I have spent the last 4 decades really trying to understand learning and development in children, particularly children with exceptional learning needs, and children with autism are my passion. And then trying to take new research and translate that into sound clinical practice. Those are my passions. This is Chris Barson. I think you can see him. Hopefully you can. He is the founder and director of Positive About Autism, which is a business that provides training to professionals, to families, to anyone who's interested in autism and understanding it from a strengths point of view and taking positive approaches. He also has more recently developed an in-depth online training program in the area of autism with his autism workroom. You'll get those connections at the end. We will give you the contact information. So I just want to make sure everybody's comfortable. You have your tea or your coffee or your water, and that you mute your mics, please, if you don't mind. I think that'll make it more comfortable for everybody. And if you can put on your cameras, it really makes it so much easier talking to real people. Whoop, there's Doten. Got her? Good, thanks. So it makes it so much easier. It feels like you've got a community experience rather than a one-sided one. So if you can please put on your cameras, it really helps to see your happy faces out there. And yeah, we've had so much isolation over the last year plus that it's really nice to see other people's faces. Hi, Laura. Now I can see you. And then if you want to make any comments or ask any questions, please type into the chat function and Chris will compile those and make sure that we answer as many as possible. If not during this session, then certainly afterwards. We'll do our level best to answer everything. And dear. Just okay. And we're going to record, we are recording today's session just so that it gives everybody a chance to look at it again and that you can share it with other people as well. So if you really don't want yourself seen, then please feel free to stop yourself. Now, this is a whole thing on what exactly is self-regulation. And Chris very wisely asked me the question the other day, well, how did you get interested in it? And I can tell you the exact moment when it became interesting to me. I was in, just a second, sorry. I'm just going to turn that off, it's bothering me. Stop. Oh, stop. Bonjour, bonjour, bonjour. Go away. Thank you. Sorry, that's just my telephone talking to me. I was at a group home. This is a self-contained residence for about a half dozen adults, young adults with significant learning problems, developmental disabilities, learning disabilities. And I was standing in their living room waiting for my young person to come and chat with me. And there was a young man, and he kept pacing up and down. Every so often, he'd flop himself into a chair, and he'd look around, and then he'd pace again. And I said to one of the staff there, I said, is there something that, can some way to help him? She said, oh, he's just waiting for us to tell him what to do. And that just about broke my heart. I thought, he is waiting. This is a young adult, and he is waiting for some staff member to tell him what to do. And that's where the whole notion of self-regulation and making decisions for yourself became a very prominent issue in my life in working with children and young adults. So self-regulation really has a long history. We've heard more about it in the last, say, 20 years, but it really has quite a long history. there was a fellow by the name of Claude Bernard, who was a French physiologist, and he became really interested in how people can maintain balance under stress. And that was in the 1860s, which is really interesting. And he believed that we needed balance in our bodies. We needed that balance in order to be free and live independent lives, which is quite interesting when you look at how long ago that was. And then we're skipping ahead to the early 1900s, Walter Cannon, who is an American physiologist, worked with Bernard, and he continued to study how people respond physically and emotionally to events. So he coined the term, which we hear quite often, fight or flight, in relation to both our physical and psychological responses to emergencies. Either we stay and fight, or we flee, we take flight, we escape that situation. So you can see that this has a very long history. Then there was struggles with the various theories and things, and then through to the 50s, finally in the 50s, there were three main schools of thought. There was behavioral school, which really looked at external factors as controlling our behavior, so that what we did for reward or to avoid punishment. And self-regulation, behaviorists believe that self-regulation, the behaviors could be identified and rewarded and self-monitored. The person could do that, and they would regulate themselves. So it was achieved by learning, by the child's learning, or the young adult's learning also, to adapt and comply with a system that rewarded the kind of behavior you were looking for. Then there was a social cognitive, and these looked at much more internal factors that control behavior. Self-regulation was achieved through cognitive systems like impulse control, your attention, so that your self-regulation was really viewed as your ability to set and work towards a goal, that you were controlling your attention, your concentration, and you're controlling your impulses. Then the third school of thought is sensory, so that internal sensory systems control your behavior. So self-regulation is achieved by modulating, by easing up or intensifying the senses, and then integrating those sensory systems. So you've got some really interesting different approaches to what self-regulation was about. And just as an example of the social cognitive was Walter Mischel. He was the guy who did the marshmallow test with children. He did it primarily with preschoolers, where he would have a child in a room with an adult, and the adult will put one marshmallow in front of the child. They used other things too, but the marshmallow was mainly what they used. And the adult would tell them, if you just wait for 15 minutes, you not only can have that marshmallow, but I'm going to give you another one. So it was really looking at delayed gratification and impulse control. And you really have to watch. There are some on YouTube, and it's so interesting watching the children. You see some of them who just immediately ate it, to heck with it, I'm fine, I'm good with one. And then other ones who just looked at the marshmallow, picked it up and licked it, and then put it back on the plate, waiting again 14 and a half more minutes until the adult would come back. And it's really quite delightful watching these children struggling with this self-regulation. The findings of it were really fascinating. They found that long-term, because they watched these children over many years, and they found that long-term, the children who were successful, who were able to delay the gratification, who were able to control their impulses, that they got higher SAT or Scholastic Achievement Test scores. They had better relationship with peers. They were more successful in high school. And it was really interesting. They were also less likely to become substance abusers, which is very interesting when you look at, this is just impulse control and delayed gratification. So that was Walter, and some very interesting things. And then there's Jean Ayres. She was an American occupational therapist, and she developed a system a model of sensory regulation, and she focused on sensory systems like tactile, touch, vestibular, that sense of balance and movement, proprioceptive, that joint position to know where your body is, and visual, knowing, getting information through sight, auditory, hearing, gustatory, taste, and olfactory, smell. So she was looking at all those systems and saying that, they have to be integrated. And she believed that the sensory processing and integration of these senses were a foundation to self-regulation. And it's really interesting because I can remember when, I would say in the 70s, that her sensory integration model was becoming more prominent, and how a lot of people scoffed at it. And she kept on and kept on, and occupational therapists really kept moving with this and didn't give up with it. But there were some interesting trials that she went through, and people really thought that some of it was a little ridiculous. But she found that some of the children, and this is primarily through observation, because when you look at it in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we didn't have a lot of really refined ways to look at the sensory systems within our bodies, like through brain imaging and that kind of thing. But she found that some children had problems detecting senses, modulating them, keeping them from overwhelming them, and interpreting them and organizing those senses. She found that some children were under-responsive, so that they really, if sounds were blasting at them, they didn't tend to respond at all. They were very under-responsive. There were children who were over-responsive, so that if it was the slightest sound or the slightest touch, that they would just, really overreact to it. And there were others who were sensory seeking. Those are our little guys that tend to bump into people and need that sort of that sensory input to understand things about their body and where they are. So she believed that when children are well regulated, they can adapt better to changes, they can respond more appropriately to events, they can learn more easily. And I remember one so-called research study that was done at a hospital I worked at, and they said, okay, well, fine then, if she says that they can learn better, then some children are coming in for tutoring, so let's give some of them some time doing some sensory integration activities, and another group not giving any. And they said, see, they didn't learn any better. I think that they could have probably used a more refined approach, but it was interesting and just gave me a taste of what Jean Ayres had to put up with and struggle onward with. Then in the 90s, this is where Jean Ayres got her comeuppance, because it was really interesting. There was much more emphasis on cognitive and neuroscience influences on behavior. And the 1990s were declared the decade of the brain, right? So they, they really worked on emphasis on neuroplasticity, that your brain can adapt to different experiences. It can adapt to injury also, so that it is plastic. It can mold and adapt to different situations. And looking at the impact of disease on the brain and ways to improve exploring the brain, like functional magnetic resonance imaging, got it. A whole bunch of these things really came out in the 90s. And it was quite fascinating that they found that a lot of what Jean Ayres was talking about in the 60s and 70s, actually, they were able to verify a lot of them with these more refined methods, which was quite wonderful, because she stuck to her guns, and it was quite intriguing. Now, when we look at, we're into the 90s, and then it wasn't until about the 2000s that we really started looking at self-regulation in children with exceptionalities, children with special learning needs, etc. Okay, so where does this bring us? We've gone through the 1860s onward, and we've learned about some various approaches to self-regulation and ways self-regulation was thought. So where does this bring us? We're at the crossroads here. So we've got behavioral, we've got sensory, we've got social cognitive, and now we've got the neurological side to things. So what does this all mean? So the behavioral approaches, are still widely adopted. They are used very broadly in this world, and they look at self-regulation in terms of behavioral self-monitoring or self-management. So they talk about teaching children how to self-manage. So that involves helping children see what behaviors they're going to be looking for. So I keep my hands to myself, or I have quiet hands. That could be one of the behaviors that they're self-monitoring. So that they have that on a list saying, okay, here's the behavior we're looking for. And then the child starts monitoring themselves, like, okay, did I do it or didn't I? So they either check or cross out. And then they have to receive so many checks before they receive a reward, whatever that is determined beforehand. It's interesting, but when I really looked at the research in this area and in my own experience, it works if the adult's present, and if the monitoring system is present, it can work also. But generalization to other situations and other people is really inconsistent. Children needed to have that system in place to manage their behavior. They needed prompting to use their systems, and the changes that did occur didn't seem to be maintained over time. So there we've got that generalization, using the skills in different situations. That is a really critical part of the self-regulation. I had one lovely fellow I worked with, and he and I worked really intensively, and he just came along really nicely. I was really proud of him, and I was told he would never talk. He certainly did, perhaps too much by the end of things. He was just a delight. And his school asked me if I could come and observe him. So I'm great. Okay, I'd love to do that. And so anyway, I went and I watched him. I thought, okay, he's doing pretty well. He's staying on task. He is really trying to do what the teachers are asking him to do. So I was quite pleased. So I met with the teacher to debrief afterwards. And he said to me, would you mind coming to school with him every day? We've never seen him like this. So I was his prompter. And he did very well, but they hadn't seen that in him before. They hadn't seen that generalization. They hadn't seen what he was able to do. And I was the person who he connected that with. So there, my generalization, his internalizing of those behaviors was not strong enough. So here is just an example chart. So in art, I use my just right voice. So I can, and I am in my space. So yes or no, those are the two target behaviors. And so if the child says, if it says yes, then the child can check that box. If the child checks in, then they go no, so they can't get a reward. Right, so that is the kind of thing. During circle time, I use my just right voice. I'm in my space. So that's the kind of thing, and it can be very involved, but this is just a nice, simple example. So now we get into sensory, and I've worked with some really wonderfully experienced, knowledgeable, qualified occupational therapists. So I have experienced sensory integration a la Jean Ayres with occupational therapists and children that I've worked with. Sensory diets, that is using different types of things. I'll show you in a minute some examples of it, but some children who need alerting, so you would use some activities that would make them more alert and get them more engaged and ready to learn. And the Wilbarger protocol, I don't know if it's still used, I think it is, but it's part of a sensory diet. It's got a series of brushes that are used with children, either very bristly brushes or soft brushes, to try to activate or soothe the sensory system. And then there's the alert program, which was sometimes called How Does Your Engine Run? And in that, children learn how to recognize their arousal level, whether they're very excited or whether they're calm, and then the children are taught sensory-based kinds of activities to help calm themselves or alert themselves. So as I said, Ayer's predictions about sensory registration, modulation, and were strongly supported in a lot of studies that were done, with the more refined methods of neuroimaging. But to date, the research into sensory integration still is not solid enough to show that there's a clear path to improving learning. I certainly have seen for myself how sensory integration, sensory diet activities can calm and center children by using these techniques. I remember one boy who came into my office one day for his regular session, and he was just flying. He was just bouncing off the walls, quite literally. So I said, his mom was in tow, and I said to her, let's go. We had a sensory room in our office. So I said, come on, let's go. And we set up a hammock and put him in it, turned down the lights, and just rocked him back and forth between the mom and me repeatedly for a while. And you could just see him calm down. So I see those techniques as having a place in my therapy anyway, that they really do have an impact on the children. But I found also, and research shows too, that they need to be repeatedly done throughout the day, which is not always practical. And adult guidance is really needed, and really knowledgeable adult guidance too. I wouldn't trust myself to try one of these things. I would really want an OT, a knowledgeable, experienced OT to guide me. So generally, again, generalization and maintenance are inconsistent. So there's that bringing it into ourselves, that self of the self-regulation is still not happening. That they need lots of adult guidance and lots of adult input in order to regulate. So here are some examples of sensory things. Here's a body sock. It's typically made of neoprene, so the child can push and really get deep joint compression, and so that can be very alerting and very stabilizing for a lot of children. Trampolines also, that you get that deep pressure, and that can be very alerting, very calming, depending upon the child. You see the headphones for auditory. That's a really common thing we see a lot with a lot of children. And swings, there we are, vestibular stimulation, using swings and hammocks, scooter boards. All of these things are used to help children regulate their sensory systems. So then we've got the social cognitive, and this approach takes lots of different forms. Some examples are zones of regulation, which is a sort of a hybrid with some sensory features. And there's Schenker self-reg, which focuses on stress and reducing stress in children. And then there's social skills training programs. Those are all social cognitive. They would fall within that realm. Now, zones of regulation is a really popular program, and conceptually is very appealing. Children are taught to be aware of, control their emotions and their impulses, and manage their sensory needs, and improve their problem-solving skills. Those are the goals of zones of regulation. It's used really widely, but to date, I could find only one study, and I did check with Leah Kuipers, the author of the program. I said, do you have any current research? And the only thing I was able to find was one study where there was an 11-week program, use of the program with preschoolers, and they found no significant improvements in their cognitive functioning, in their communication, their motor, social, emotional, or adaptive skills. So it's got some true conceptual appeal, or they're very popular, but there's not much research support for any of these programs. People talk, like Stuart Shanker talks about how it's research informed rather than evidence-based, and so that it's like you take a whole, some ideas from research and finding some research and bring them together, which would be research informed rather than studying the program itself to see its impact. So for the Shanker program, there is no research that I was able to find, and that they discussed on their own websites. So again, generalization of skills is a real problem. Calmness alone isn't enough for children to self-regulate. Being calm is a really important thing, and being able to de-stress. All of us know this. It's a very important thing, but it's the generalization, that again, that self, that child's ability to do it themselves is not there. So, and then also social skills programs. I've done social skills programs with my guys, with lots of children, and I really believe in the importance of that. But then again, when you look at the research, there is really inconsistent generalization. Children don't tend to use them in multiple situations, and they don't tend to maintain those skills either. I remember one lovely fellow I worked with. He was on the autism spectrum, just a delightful, caring, wonderful boy. His mom called me one day and said he bit another student at the school. I thought, what? And she said, yeah, he bit another student. So anyway, I was going to see him the next Saturday, and I said, I understand that something happened with one of the other kids at school. Like, I would never say to a child, you bit that child, because that just is not conducive to a good debriefing. So I said, I understand there was a problem with another student the other day. And he said, yeah, she called me a girl. And he said, so I bit her. And I said, oh man, that's probably not the best thing to do. Huh? I said, what kind of stuff could you do? Because we had already gone through this. We had gone through what you do in that situation. What are the things you look for in yourself? How you can keep your thoughts to yourself. We did video modeling, video arrays, social stories on all of this stuff. And when it really came time to use it, there was our generalization wasn't there. So he knew what to do. He had the intention to do it, because I know him very well. He's now 30 years of age, but that was when he was about 8. And he is a very nice person. And I know he had the intention, but when it came to use it, nothing was happening. So that is where we have problems. So, where is the self in self-regulation? When we don't get generalization, when we don't get maintenance, we have to say, so what is it that is not integrating into the self of that person? So in putting the self in self-regulation, behavioral, sensory, and social cognitive programs somehow forget that self. Like they're teaching regulation, because they're teaching children how to monitor behaviors and regulating behaviors and maintaining, or not maintaining, but regulating their behaviors and manage their behaviors, but they're not, where's the self? There seemed to be that breakdown. Like I told you with my boy, he knew about it, he knew what to do, he intended to do it, but then when it came to time to do it, it didn't occur. So then I came across the most amazing, interesting thing. This is Hans Lucas Huber, one of the founders of neuropsychology, and I was reading through, because I was trying to understand where this breakdown was occurring. Like, why? Because I could see a lot of things I was doing that we had, that the child knew what to do, they intended to do it, and then comes the moment, oh, it didn't happen. And then he talked about people who had frontal lobe damage, just right up here, showed a curious dissociation or disconnection between knowing and doing. And I went, aha, I think that's my key to generalization. Because it is a problem we've read about for decades and decades, that in children with autism in particular, they just don't generalize. Well, I took this further. Like I said to you, I'm really interested in translating research into practice. So, okay, what does this mean? So, okay, if it involves the frontal lobe, so that's got to be executive functions. Those are right here. Executive functions depend on those frontal lobes. Executive functions are a family of brain circuits that help us prioritize, integrate, and regulate other cognitive functions. They're the things that bring our thoughts and our intentions into action. They're called executives. Some people say that they're like a business executive who looks at and say, okay, how are we going to plan out this manufacturing process or this analysis process, whatever process it is? Do we have the staff to do it? How am I going to integrate these pieces? How am I going to monitor that it's happening? How can we make sure that it ends up being what we had in mind? So they're important when you're doing things that you need to think about. And that's an important distinction. We can do some things on automatic. There's a lovely, lovely woman by the name of Dr. Adele Diamond from the University of British Columbia. She has the research chair in developmental neurology in children, something to that effect. She's an absolutely delightful woman. But anyway, she was a dancer from an early age, and she traveled around all over Europe dancing in a troupe. And she said, you know, the one thing that I have to do on automatic now is dancing. She said, if I start thinking about it, it starts falling apart. So there are some things that we do on automatic, but I would say that initially when she was learning how to dance, she was more aware of, okay, I put my left foot here, put my right foot there, all of those pieces that need to be prioritized and integrated and regulated in order to actually follow through in dance. And I was thinking also that when we learn how to drive, it's such a conscious effort initially. Okay, I open the door to the car. Okay, I've got my keys or key fob now. All right, I start the car. Okay, I have a standard. Okay, I have to put my clutch in first. And all of those things you had to remember in order, what you had to do first, what you had to do next, how they all come together. And then over time, it just becomes automatic. And sometimes you'll get to a place where you think, okay, did I take my normal route? Just because it has become so automatic. But when we are learning things, we have to engage that whole family of brain circuits. So, and executive functions make it possible to put our thoughts and our ideas and our intentions into action. So there are 5 key executive functions. Some people say 3, some people say 10, I say 5. The reason I chose them was because they really are prominent in the field of children with exceptional learning needs, and particularly autism. These are ones that you see quite often as being areas of difficulty. So number 1 is planning and organization. How do I manage and integrate what I need to do into a plan, right? Rather than just diving in, how do I plan this out? How do I organize this? I've got to do this, then this, then this. And then we've got good old inhibitory control with like the marshmallow test. So how do I stop some stuff from happening? How do I keep myself from blurting out like, oh, look at how wrinkly she is, or something along that line, right? You know that would hurt someone's feelings. So you have to stop yourself. And also inhibitory control keeps you doing stuff. You know, it's rather than, oh, I'd like to be outside right now. Look at that, it's sunny and lovely. And okay, I bring my inhibitory control in and say, you've got to finish what you started. Keep going, you're all right. You can do that later. So that's part of our inhibitory control. Then working memory is our temporary storage, where we hold on to information, we're making plans, we're updating that information, we're integrating with other things we know. It's like, okay, yeah, I know that. It's like when I'm learning French, temps, T-E-M-P-S, can be time or weather, right? So I integrate those things and distribute them, you know, so that they're both in the same sort of wing of my memory, but they're also separated by important meaning differences. So that's part of my working memory that helps me integrate and put those things in places where they need to be when I need them. And then there's self-monitoring, and that is checking out, how are we doing here? You know, is it what I intended to do? Is this what's really happening? Am I, you know, do I have the quality? Do I have the accuracy that I really wanted? And so that self-monitoring process is really important. And then one thing, cognitive flexibility. And I must say that I have some issues myself that I've worked on over time. And it does tell you that you can develop we do have plasticity in our brains, that we can work on these things over time. But cognitive flexibility allows you to adapt to unexpected kinds of ideas or events, and modify your old knowledge, so that it's like, oh, I guess that doesn't work any longer. I saw the most lovely picture of somebody who had difficulty with cognitive flexibility. It was two canisters, one that had sugar written on it, one that had flour written on it, and the person crossed it out and wrote the exact opposite words on them. So I guess they'd already filled up the canisters. The flour one was sugar. So okay, fine, I'm not changing it. So they wrote the name on there. So that gives you an example. Somebody having a little difficulty with cognitive flexibility. Now, just looking at executive functions and how you bring them into play when you're learning something or when you're doing a difficult task. Like if I wanted to draw this clown, I got my pencil, I got my paper. What do? I'd really like to just draw that pom-pom because I think it's cute. But you know what? I better make a plan. I better organize myself, because I got to make sure I use the paper well, right? I'm sure you've seen lots of children who start printing their name over on the right-hand side of the paper, and then they run out of space or whatever. So that planning and organization is really important. And then inhibiting those automatic responses or impulsive things, like, oh, I like his hair. Look at that. That sort of looks like ridges. And no, stay on track. What should we do first? And if we were going to be really logical about this, we'd say, let's do the biggest shape first, and that would be the head. And then that can help us draw everything else. So that would be part of our plan. And then we have to keep the plan in mind as well as that figure, so we don't have to constantly be looking back and forth at it. We can keep some pieces in our memory while we're working on that drawing. And then the self-monitoring. So how am I doing? Is it getting close? Am I just about done? Does it look sort of like that picture? And then keeping your thinking flexible. So if you run out of space, or if you drew too many strands of hair, what could you do? Because I'm sure you have met, I certainly have, children who will do something and then go, no, and they'll crumple it up and throw it away right away. Like, okay, that's where, that's where we have to help them with their flexible cognitive flexibility, etc., and their inhibitory control. So let's bring it to exactly what is self-regulation then. So self-regulation, if we really want to bring the self into it, that's that conscious control of our executive functions. That's so that our behavior, our thoughts, and our emotions don't rule us, don't rule the child. Children can adapt to different situations. So that's the control of those 5 key executive functions, right? So they can adapt to different situations. So they've got the planning, the impulse control, the self-monitoring, the cognitive flexibility, so they can just adapt to different situations. And they become more self-directed, planful, and adaptable. And that was part of that young man in the group home that really bothered me. He waited for the adult to tell him what to do. He didn't have a notion that he could direct himself, that he could make a plan, that he could adapt to that situation. The child understands the relationship between effort and achievement. Also, by using executive functions, then we help the child understand that I have to do these things and I have to think in these ways in order to do this. And that it takes practice. It's like I was saying that some things after practicing, like driving the car or dancing, they become automatic over time. And this is something that children can learn with this. So it's a process of slowing them down initially and helping them understand that their executive functions can help them. And with older children, I teach them specifically the 5 executive functions. So they can say, we call inhibitory control your brakes. Sometimes we need to put our brakes on. Now, because that helps us think and it helps us make a plan and that helps make sure that we finish what we want to do. So the thing with it too is that we don't want children just to become laws unto themselves. We want them to learn to adapt to different situations. We want them to manage their behaviors and their thinking and their emotions in ways that are acceptable. And I know some people cringe at the notion of acceptable, or I use the word appropriate sometimes, and people go, what do you mean appropriate? It's like, you know, there are cultural things that are very important to families, to communities, and that some behavior is acceptable and some isn't. I'm sorry, that's life. And so that blurting out whatever is on your mind in the middle of a sermon at the mosque or the church or the temple is probably not acceptable, right? That's that's important part of self-regulation that we teach children. I had a parent of the books on self-regulation that I've done show children doing handsprings, show a child doing handsprings. And I had the parent of 2 children with autism saying, why did you put that on there? I don't want my kids doing handsprings. And I said, you know, I really do want kids to know that there are times that they can let loose. And that's part of self-regulation, that we want our guys and our girls and our children and our young adults to know that there are times when they can go out and they can yell as loudly as they want. They can do handsprings, they can run around, they can flap, they can twiddle string. All of those things, there are times and places for those, and we can help them learn that. Because I'm always concerned about alienating other people. And one thing that one of the moms I worked with, she'd say to her son, she said, you need to stop that now because other people are going to think you're weird. Okay, I guess that calls it the way it is. But we need to help children learn that there are appropriate ways of doing things and appropriate times and places. Because we want children to have a sense of community with other people. Like one of my boys, I helped, and then one of the most wonderful experiences I've had in working with children is that he was going to do his bar mitzvah, and he had autism and significant learning problems. But I met with his cantor, and we worked out, I'm not Jewish, but we worked out what exactly was going to occur and all the things that my young man needed to do. And we spent weeks learning that together. I can still do some of it, even though it's many, many years later. But that to me was part of helping him become part of his important community so that we could work on his self-regulation and we could work on the important information he needed for that time, so that he could be part of his very important community. This is his lifelong community. So that, we want positive results in terms of well-being, loving relationships, and general quality of life, in addition to learning in general. So if I preach to you now. So when we look at all the various things we've looked at sensory regulation and that sensory integration, sensory diets. I believe they have a place. I believe they have an important place. And my experience with them has certainly been that the children, oh, Sarah, I'm sorry, Sarah, you're late. But I've certainly seen that children can be more calmed or more alerted by using sensory means. So that gets them ready. And then stress regulation. I do some of that with children too, so they can learn to calm and center themselves. They alert themselves to, ooh, I'm feeling, my tummy's wobbling, or, my neck hurts. And so those are things that I need then to help myself calm and center. So I think those are very important, but they would be considered pre-executive, right? They don't use a lot of frontal lobe, but they're important foundational. And I will agree with Jean Ayres. There are some important issues there that are foundational to helping children learn executive function self-regulation. And it's been really interesting. There have been a few programs developed using executive function as the foundation for the self-regulation programs. And one of them, Adele Diamond has been involved with, is Tools of the Mind. And it's something that is integrated into regular kindergarten classes. And they've had some really nice generalization and maintenance, as have other programs, as has my program. We've certainly seen some very nice generalization and maintenance. I got a lovely note from a person just a short while ago, and she said, 5 years after we did this, children are still using the strategies and still talking to themselves, using the language that we taught them. So that you can see that there's generalization, there's maintenance, and that's very exciting. That's where I believe and I've seen that we get that self and self-regulation is using executive functions. And then I believe they're ready for the social, emotional, the social skills side of things. So once we get them being able to take over voluntary, conscious control of their bodies, their thinking and their emotions, then they can move on to learning those other skills. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, I think we're all right. So that is my preaching about what exactly is self-regulation. This is what I've found through reading volumes of research and also in my own clinical practice with children. So please give us feedback on today's webinar. You can either go to this link or scan this QR code, and it takes 3 minutes or less to complete it. So that would be really helpful. We're going to be putting this link on the website as well, on the Self-Reg Central website under the free webinars page. That will be there within 24 hours. So that would be very good for us. Then upcoming webinars, we've got one that is why is self-regulation important? We're going to do that August 31 and September 18th. We'll have a slightly different focus on each one, but there'll be some repetition, but they'll be slightly different on each. And to register, you can scan this QR code or go to Self-Reg Central for the free webinars site. And on the page also, we're going to have the recording of today's webinar, the PowerPoint slides that I've used, and a list of resources that were mentioned today. Chris has very nicely put that together. And we've got a couple of executive function surveys. So you can look at your own executive functions and see where you have some strengths and where are some areas that you can work on. And there's one for children as well. So you can look at children around you, because everyone has a slightly different profile. None of us have, or very few of us have, strengths in all areas. And then the SPARK self-regulation program of awareness and resilience in kids, that's what SPARK stands for. We're going to be doing certification training. The next sessions start in September. So you can go to there's a Wix site that is the self-regulation or the certification information, or you can scan this QR code. And as I said, this information will be on the Self-Reg Central website within 24 hours, so you can get it there as well. And then we have contacts. So if you want to contact me, you can do so through Self-Reg Central or selfregcentral@gmail.com. And Chris, contact him through positiveaboutautism.co.uk or autismworkshoптhinktific.com, or email chris@positiveaboutautism.co.uk. I think we did the hour, right? We're very close. All right, Chris.
Very good, very good. There are a couple of questions in the chat, Heather, if you have a minute or two, that have just come through, one from Doten and one from Ornita. Taking the first one from Ornita. Ornita was asking you about wondering why, despite SO, so much focus on sensory integration and occupational therapy, but there's this gap in the research. And I had noticed this too. You know, we do these things with confidence. Often we're convinced they work. Other people tell us they work. They become part of custom and practice of the way that we work with our kids in school or other settings. But how can we be sure that actually it's not emperor's new clothes? You know, we're not deceiving ourselves. What do you think?
You know, and that's why I put on each of the slides what I have found for myself in my experience, as well as what I found in the literature. To me, an SI is, you know, there's still when I because I looked the other day saying, okay, what is the most recent? Because I did an article or a chapter a couple of years ago, and I thought, okay, I better check up just to make sure that I'm up to snuff. And they said there still is not clear information on whether it actually does facilitate learning. So, you know, and what it, her predictions, research is needed to examine whether intervention using sensory integration approach will help improve sensory registration and or modulation impairments, particularly in children with autism, by developing more efficient network connectivity. So that was the statement made, the summary statement made in the research, was that there still is, you know, that they still have not been able to show that it does actually make a big difference. I myself, I have experienced, like I said, with that young boy who came into my office just flying. I thought, there's no way we're going to be able to work together. But after a few minutes, calming in a hammock, there he was. So I think that there are certain practices, as long as we use them judiciously and with guidance from experienced, knowledgeable occupational therapists, I think they have a place, but they're not giving the self of self-regulation.
I think so too. You know, we can't stop everything that we do because of a lack of research evidence, because we'd end up doing very little in the classroom, very little at home, unless there was a huge body of research evidence. Because for most therapies, interventions and approaches, there is a gap where we need this research evidence for sure.
Absolutely.
I think, what we need to be is to be a little bit canny and a little bit foxy when we're working with a child, you know, we can be sure that we've set targets and that we're gathering data in a useful way about, well, is this stuff working? Is this person able to wait longer for this now? You know, are there less behavioral difficulties than there were before? Are they learning at an individual by individual basis? I think.
Absolutely.
You know, in a
but
way,
do it very carefully, and don't, as you say, don't just do it.
we have to be the research.
Evaluate it and be, and I'm extremely critical of myself. I am so critical of myself. When I'm working with children, I really like, okay, did that work? Did that actually make a difference? If it didn't make a difference, it's my responsibility to change it. I've told many people that when you try something with a child, you should see change pretty quickly. I will give somebody 3 months, but myself, I'll give a few weeks of trying something. If it's not making a difference, then you have to go back to the drawing board, and it's okay to do that.
And as someone
about it, right?
Pointed out in the chat, we work with so many different kinds of children. Autism is so wide, so diverse, both in terms of level of intellectual functioning and all of the rest of this technicolor spectrum that we work with.
Yeah.
Expecting one therapy approach intervention to work with every kid just because they have the A label, that's just plain silly. We know we're going to have to try 10 things. 9 of them, most of the time, will be useless, but one thing will work.
And that's okay. That's part of the process. And so you've got to, don't get your ego in there. It's okay, right?
Our second question in the chat, which we've got a couple of minutes for, I guess, is what about children with who are pre-verbal or non-verbal children? Is self-regulation possible with those children? Is it more difficult? Do we have to come at it from a different angle? What are your thoughts on that, Heather?
Well, it is more challenging indeed, and we would look at it slightly differently. But I still find that children can learn. You engage them through their strengths. So some children I've worked with, and we've used music and rhythm, and so that we can make drums go really fast, drums go really slowly. That's learning to self-regulate my body, right? So it can be very, very, very simple, because I've had people say, well, you could never do this with a nonverbal child. You could never do this with a lower functioning child, but you can. You just have to find, just look, like any child, you have to find things that are appealing and that draw their attention and their interest. Those are their favorite things, their passions, and you engage them in that. So I find music and rhythm to be a beautiful way to start with so many children, so that we can clap our hands, we can stomp our feet, we can do all sorts of things that are very simple movements, but do them quickly, do them slowly, do them very softly, do them very hard. And you can do that kind of thing so that they can learn. And that's what you emphasize. It's like, look at how you controlled your body. That's fantastic. You told your hands to go slowly. That was excellent, right? And so really, you would take it from a very simple, from that simple point. And it's the kind of things you would do in a typical classroom anyway. You would do some music and rhythm, and so you just do it at different paces, and give the child that feedback that, wow, look at how you told your body what to do, right?
Yeah.
That makes sense?
It makes sense. Thank you.
Okay.
We're running out of time, I know,
Yes.
but just to remind people that in the chat, I've put a PDF document there, a document that you can click on at 6:53 p.m. If you scroll back through the chat, you can see there, you should be able to open that. I've just checked it and it works for me. Hopefully it works for you as well, with links to a lot of the things that Heather talked about in the webinar. email addresses, websites as well. Some of the videos, Heather mentioned the wonderful Adele Diamond, and I put a link there to one of her videos, and her, the program that Heather mentioned there. So do click on that to download it, so that you are able to access those. But we will put that document together with everything else, as Heather said, the PowerPoint presentation that you've just seen, the recording of the session as well. We'll put all of those things together and make sure that they're accessible to everyone for the duration after the webinar. And maybe see you all at the next one.
So, and feel free to share this with other people, because that's our goal here, is that we want people to start thinking more in this direction and trying things out for themselves. And on the survey also, I'm asking, are there topics that you would be particularly interested in hearing about? Because we've got just one other topic lined up at the moment. I'm thinking of others, but I would love your input and things that you would like to hear and you would like to have discussed. All right, it'd be very nice. Okay.